Over the course of about a dozen or so years, I have won countless fantasy championships and $19,000 alone last year playing fantasy football. And one of the most important things you have to understand about football compared to other sports like basketball, like baseball, is that this is such a brutally violent sport, even though it has been watered down so much over the years. So that means that the fantasy playoff time, a lot of guys are injured and just are not playing well because of injury. So there's a lot of different tips and tricks that I have learned over that dozen or so years to help put me in position better to win fantasy championships, and I'm going to share those tricks with you today. But I'm doing everything I can to make sure you win your fantasy championship, so make sure to go down there, drop a like on the video, subscribe to the channel to show your support. Now I want to start out with this first thing because I say this a lot on my channel in any video, and particularly when it comes to live streams when I'm answering questions about who to start any week. Going with your own gut is always a tried and true way to play fantasy football. And I want to walk through a couple of examples, right? So when you go to our site, fsroundup.com, if you are a premium subscriber there are two things that you could utilize on our site. Number one is you could go to see my rankings on a weekly basis, which at this point are top 270 to top 300 players on a weekly basis. So if you are struggling with who to play on a weekly basis, you can utilize the rankings. But the other important feature that you could utilize as a premium subscriber is the comparison feature. Now, this feature, you can sync up two or more players and decide who to start in that situation based on a multitude of different factors, including my rankings. So I want to walk through a couple of examples just using this past week, week 14. So Chris Olave and T. Higgins were back-to-back in my rankings, with Chris Olave one spot over T. Higgins. Now, I said a lot during last week, T. Higgins was a really good play because I didn't worry about weather when it came to that Bills and Bengals game. Both quarterbacks are very used to that kind of weather. They both have big arms. They can pierce it through the wind. I didn't worry about that, but I still liked Olave a little bit better by the tune of one spot, because of the fact that Chris Olave had done it for a long time this year, being the number one target and being targeted into oblivion. Well, if you look back to what actually happened week 14, I was dead wrong. This would be the opportune moment for you to say, hey, listen, I've got this guy who says these two guys are back-to-back spots ranked. What if my gut tells me to go with T. Higgins, though? You need to go with your gut and just say, this guy's an idiot, and I'm not going to listen to him on this one. Because a lot of times, guys, and I always say this too, when there is a consensus built against me, you guys are typically right. If I'm wrong and you guys build a consensus and the mass majority says, you're very wrong and you look really dumb right now, guess what? A lot of the times you guys are spot on and I am the one who looks dumb. And when it comes to this time of the year, you got to the fantasy playoffs based on the decisions you made each day, week in and week out. So you need to stick with those decisions because one loss will send you home at this time of the year. Now, I don't want to just say that only when my rankings are close, you should go with your gut. That's also not the case either. A lot of times I get things wrong. That's why I have a segment, What I Got Right and Wrong, on Monday nights. There's also a lot of situations where I've got guys well ranked over someone who outperforms them. Another example this past week is Rashee Rice and Michael Wilson. If you went to the comparison feature and lined these two guys up, you would see that I had Rashee Rice ranked as my 16th overall player in week 14, and I had Michael Wilson as my 23rd overall player. Now, that one was a clear victory to Michael Wilson, who is, as of now, the number one wide receiver in week 14. Now, I had spent a good part of the week saying, leading into that week, I think Rashee Rice is in for not his great game. I think the Texans defense will absolutely eat him up, and it was going to be a statement ranking him as low as I did because typically he's much higher. But I was wrong on that, and I should have ranked him lower. So if you were utilizing my rankings exclusively and not going with your own intuition, you would have gotten it wrong as well because I would have played Rashee Rice over Michael Wilson too. But that is my whole point. Going with your gut at this time of the year is the difference between losing a matchup and winning a matchup, because Michael Wilson just had a week-winning week. And same thing with T. Higgins. Those two guys just had massive performances that can't be replicated in anybody's lineup. So going with your gut is easily the most important thing. And the next thing that leads me to is riding the wave. So when you've got a player, for example, that is playing really well, you typically don't want to put that player on the bench if they've had 2 or 3 straight great performances. The thought process of putting a player like that on your bench is a very ridiculous thing to think of. Now, a lot of times you may ask me, well, I've got this guy I paid a first rounder or a second rounder for, and this guy I picked up on waivers, he's just been doing so well. It feels crazy for me to bench him, but also it feels crazy for me to bench a different guy that I paid so much more for in the actual draft. And to that I say, you need to ride the wave with the guys that are doing well right now. So the perfect example for this one, I think, is Michael Wilson. So Michael Wilson, as the wide receiver 1 in Arizona, he's had 3 games now. And he has had 33.5, 21.8, and 37.2 full PPR fantasy point games as the wide receiver 1 in Arizona. So that tells me one thing. We are able to identify trends, and you should be able to identify a lot of patterns much easier at this point in the season than you could at the beginning of the season. We've identified enough with Michael Wilson that when he is the wide receiver 1 standalone in Arizona, he is a dominant must-start fantasy player. So that means that I don't care if you have to bench Rashee Rice. I don't care if you have to bench Jalen Waddle, Ladd McConkey, A.J. Brown. I don't care who you have to bench in order for Michael Wilson to go in. He is a must-play player if he is going to be the lone wide receiver 1 in Arizona. And this one could be a factor moving forward depending on how long Marvin misses with the heel injury. Another guy that's a great example of this is Christian Watson. So Christian Watson and Michael Wilson, by the way, are both waiver wire pickups. When you look at Christian Watson, this guy is still decently available, not in every league at this point, obviously. But you look at his last 4 games, 20.6 fantasy points, 9.9, 18.3, and 24.9. And so we had 1 game that was less than 18 fantasy points in a full PPR format. And I have also argued this over the weeks as well. Christian Watson has gotten to a point where his floor has really stabilized. It is no longer 3 points. It is no longer 0 points. Christian Watson has about an 8 to 10 point floor. Now, with the return of Jaden Reed, maybe that does change. But the point of the matter is that Christian Watson should be in lineups moving forward because of the wave that he is riding and the importance that he has had electrifying this offense down the field. That is not going to change in Green Bay's offense. And another great example of this is Jacoby Brissett at the quarterback position, because there's a lot of underperforming quarterbacks right now. You know who would be the best ride-it-out player? Jacoby Brissett. Jacoby Brissett has had no game worse than 18 fantasy points since becoming the starter in Arizona, and that's been a total of 8 games. Not 2, not 4, not 3. He's had 8 games as a starter, and he has not had a bad fantasy day since. And keep in mind, he has played defenses like the Los Angeles Rams, like the Seattle Seahawks. He has not exactly had the easiest road of schedule that you've seen from a fantasy quarterback. He's had tough matchups, and he has still done well. So that just capitalizes my entire point on this one. You need to ride the wave with certain players when it comes to being a fantasy football manager at this time of the year. Because a lot of times, a lot of your high-priced guys that you paid for in draft season are not working out right now. And that leads me into my third tip right here. You need to end marriages with underperforming stars on your team. You need to not be afraid of this one right here. And I know that's a tough one, because if you paid a first rounder for Justin Jefferson or Saquon Barkley, for example, who we recover here in a little bit more deeper, you need to say to yourself, is it worth it? Or did I just get here in spite of those 2 guys? Because if you're in your fantasy playoffs, those 2 guys did not help you. But there's realistically countless more examples. So we'll get into another one right here. Baker Mayfield, for example. Baker Mayfield, I got a lot of flack for leaving out of my top 16 quarterback rankings this past week. And I said to people, that was not an accident. This was no accident for me to leave Baker Mayfield out. Because if you look at Baker's game log, his last 7 games, 5 of them have been less than 17 fantasy points, and some of them have been complete and utter disasters. Week tanking weeks is what you've been getting from Baker Mayfield. So you cannot tell me and look me in the eye and say Baker Mayfield is a great quarterback in fantasy anymore. And the problem with that is that Baker Mayfield has become a big name player. So a lot of people think if I see Baker Mayfield on waivers, not only am I picking him up, but I'm putting him right into my lineup because I'd rather play him than Bo Nix. I would personally argue I'd rather play Bo Nix than Baker because Bo Nix has had a ceiling of 25, where Baker, in the reality, the last 7 games, has had a ceiling of 17 points, basically. That's basically Baker. So Baker is a great example. Then you look over to his wide receiver in Tampa, Emeka Egbuka. And this one hurts me because I have been a massive Emeka Egbuka defender since day one. I said he was a wide receiver, locked and loaded, wide receiver 1 in fantasy moving forward. But you cannot ignore these numbers anymore. Emeka Egbuka has had less than 10 fantasy points in 7 of his last 8 games. And I can point this back to when he first got injured against the Los Angeles Rams and left the game early. Since then, he has not been the same player. He's still getting the amount of opportunities that he once did, but he has not been the same player. And then you add on the fact that Chris Godwin has come back into the lineup. Mike Evans could be returning soon. Emeka Egbuka should no longer be viewed as a wide receiver 1, even possibly a wide receiver 2 in fantasy. You need to move off of these type of guys who you are getting wins despite, not because of, at this point in the fantasy season. And of course, that leads me to our 2 biggest stars, because you might say to me, well, Emeka Egbuka and Baker, they're stars, I guess, but they weren't exactly high draft pick type of guys. Saquon Barkley was. Saquon Barkley was an enormous cost. He was a first-round pick. And you know what he's done? He's had less than 13.5 fantasy point games in 6 of his last 7 games, and only 1 game this year. 1 game in the entire year, he's had a 20-plus point game in fantasy football. You cannot tell me that Saquon Barkley has been the reason you are in your fantasy playoffs right now. You have been winning in spite of your first-round pick because you were able to hit on several picks after Saquon Barkley. This is a prime guy that I've been saying for weeks now on my rankings videos. If I can sit him, I will. And the same thing applies to the number 1 massive bust, Justin Jefferson. Justin Jefferson, also a first-round pick, I would argue has been even worse. And we can discuss whether it's his fault or not. I am not telling you it's Justin Jefferson all of a sudden being a bad player. But you are at a dependent position when you're a wide receiver and your quarterback cannot support you for 20-point games. He has one 20-point game in 2025, much like Saquon Barkley does, and 5 straight games he's had less than 12 fantasy points. So we're not just talking about a guy who has barely hit a ceiling. We're talking about a guy whose floor has decreased to a level that is almost unplayable and absolutely crushing your team on a weekly basis. These are 2 guys that are high-priced guys that you might say to me, well, it feels weird to get to the playoffs and not play my top picks. I'm telling you the exact opposite. If you've got a guy like Jonathan Taylor, for example, he may go through a rough patch here without Daniel Jones moving forward. I would still play him because I have seen a good floor with him and, of course, the enormous ceiling. With a guy like Saquon and a guy like Justin Jefferson, when their floors are that low and they're not giving you ceiling games on a consistent basis, that's when I say to you, you should not feel scared whatsoever putting these guys on the bench for better options such as the ride-the-wave players like Michael Wilson and Christian Watson. Now that leads me to another point right here, which is to play the waiver wire. And of course, this is always something you do throughout the year if you are a very consistent fantasy manager. But I will tell you this right here. The waiver wire becomes so much more important as the season goes on for fantasy football than it is in week 1. And I will say this, in the first 4 weeks, that's typically when you're going to find massive season-long guys that are going to make massive contributions to your team. But this is the time of the year where you're going to find the late league-winning types of guys. So we create articles weekly on the site. This is me who does this, about top waiver wire additions that you should make before the particular week of fantasy football starts. So just to go through a couple of names that have been on those lists right there in those articles. Kyle Monangai, Devin Neal, Luther Burden, Jaden Reed, Christian Watson. Those are just a couple of examples of guys who already have emerged or are emerging and were picked up off waiver wires or are still available off the wire. Kyle Monangai has become a weekly flex option with a 20-point ceiling. Devin Neal just had a big game this past week for an injured Alvin Kamara, who is still on waiver wires right now. Luther Burden has become a much more important player even before Rome Odunze went down, and now with Rome down, could be a massive league-winning player for your fantasy playoffs. Jaden Reed and Christian Watson, those two guys in Green Bay's offense, which is suddenly emerging, those two guys could be massive league-winning types of players that are not situationally dependent on their particular offense and any injuries to a guy in front of them. These are starter-worthy players that have flexible upside on a weekly basis moving forward. Now look at other guys, right? Blake Corum, Tyler Algier. Those two guys are considered backup or handcuff running backs at the running back position. But these two guys, if you actually looked at their game log, they have enough standalone value that they can be flexed on a weekly basis because they're consistently involved in the offensive game plan on a weekly basis at this point. But if their starters go down, Kyron Williams or Bijan Robinson, not that I am wishing this happens, but if they were to go down, they would become league-winning types of players. They should not be on waivers. And I will say the best part about those two guys is they're never priority waiver ads. If they're on your waiver wire today, the good chance is that unless you pick them up, they'll still be on wire. So every single week, there's waiver priorities that run through automatically in the middle of the night. And then the most competitive leagues, you're getting up at 3 in the morning to go grab the best remaining free agents for free. Our automatic waiver tool on the site has completely automated that process for you. So you can sleep through the night and still beat all the other players in your league trying to go for those free agents. That's what you need to do to maximize your window of winning the championship this year. And in addition to that premium subscription with the automatic waiver tool, you'll also get access to my top 270 rankings on a weekly basis, the comparison feature that we highlighted earlier, and the league sync up feature as well. And when you refer a friend to FS Roundup, you and your friend will get an entire month for free on our site. Now, let's go through the last tip really quick. Matchups matter. Matchups always matter, and this is a pretty obvious one as well. And I will say this mostly applies to the defensive position. So many of you know me as a big fantasy football defense content creator in the fantasy space. And yes, I do favor defense a lot because it gives you a massive edge when it comes to fantasy football, especially this time of the year. So defense is like the Seahawks and the Texans, for example, right? These are two elite level defenses in the NFL. They have a great defensive unit from top to bottom. But then when you factor in their playoff schedule, and you can see those playoff schedules on your own time, those two are the top two defenses in fantasy football for the playoff stretch because of skill that they have as a unit and because of record. But when you look at other matchups, right, and you say to yourself, what about the Broncos defense? That's an elite defense here. And I would say, yes, I think there's still a top 12 defensive play for the fantasy playoffs, but they're not the same level as the Bucs and the Saints, who I don't consider elite defenses by any stretch of the imagination. But matchups matter at this time of the year, and those two defenses have done enough for me to say, I think we have some opportunities here when you play teams like the Carolina Panthers, potentially like the Tennessee Titans, teams that have inconsistent or worse offenses than the majority of other teams who have good defenses, but really tough matchups moving forward. But this all goes back to going with your gut, because the same thing is applied to the wide receiver position, to the running back position, to the quarterback position, so on and so forth. You have guys that you would typically start, but are not exactly locked and loaded players. If they've got a tough matchup, that could swing things for you. Again, going with your gut is what it all leads back to. So these are the 5 tips. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope it gives you value. And if you want to see the updated top 12 defense rankings for the fantasy playoffs, click on this video right here.